Now being recorded. Hello, everybody. My name is David Kramer. I am the director of the library here at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it is once again our pleasure to welcome Ilana Kurshan to speak about now a new book. Um, which obviously will be of interest to all of us. Let me just say a few words before we begin about ground rules to keep this as peaceful as possible. Please do stay on mute. I promise if you stray off of mute, I will find a way to remute you, so you really don't have to worry about it. But it would be easier if I didn't have to find you. The way the time will be allotted is that after my introduction, Ilana will present about her new book, Children of the Book, for about a half hour, at which time I will ask a few questions and then we'll open up to questions from you. So if you've got questions, please feel free to record them. If you want, you can throw them into chat, but you don't need to do that. You'll be welcome to actually express your questions on your own when the time comes for that exchange. So to begin again, the Library of JTS, one of the great homes of Jewish books in the world, is interested not only in old books, but in recent books and new books and, books of Jewish interest at all levels, which makes this particular book of considerable interest to us as well as to our audience. As I said, Ilana has been with us before for a book talk. She spoke about her earlier book, If All the Seas Were Ink, and I think it's fair to say that everyone who was involved learned a great deal from both her experience, the experience she wrote about, and from the writing itself. And we're in for another joyous opportunity to learn with you, Ilana, and to hear more about what you've written in your new book. I'm going to pass it over to you. I'll highlight you so that everyone can see you. There'll be no confusion. And then when we come back together, we'll reallocate the screen. So, Ilana, welcome. So, really, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Kramer, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity. Um, so I want to start by sharing with you that my youngest child, who is now 5 years old, he likes to hear the same books over and over again. Maybe this is an experience familiar to some of you who have young children or young grandchildren. No sooner have we turned the last page in whatever book we're reading than he's already pleading with me again, thrusting the book back into my arms and opening to the first page. He wants to go back to that rainy day when it's too wet to play in the Cat in the Hat, or to the evening as light begins to fade in Good Night construction site. And so, somewhat reluctantly, I oblige, even though I've already read to him 100 times about thing one and thing two and the long, rough, hard day of construction play. But my son goes through phases with books, and right now, these are the only two books he wants to read again and again and again. For parents of young children and grandparents of young children, so much of the reading we do is rereading. Children like to hear the same books over and over, maybe the same two books or the same five books, which we read in rotation one after another. But I want to suggest today that I think this is also a uniquely Jewish way of reading. Jews traditionally read the same five books over and over again in the liturgical cycle, starting in the fall, of course, with the book of Genesis, and then concluding the following fall with the book of Deuteronomy. No sooner have we read the final verses in the Torah about Moshe's death atop Har Nevo than already we're scrolling back to the creation of the world at the beginning of Genesis, such that we are always, at every moment in the Jewish calendar, in the middle of reading from the Torah. And when I think about this, I realize there's another book too that we Jews are always returning to day after day, week after week, and that's the Siddur. We recite the same prayers today as we recited yesterday. We'll recite the same prayers this Shabbat as we recited last Shabbat. And why do we do this? Well, the point is not to get through the book, to be able to say, "Oh yeah, Sidor, I read that one. Yep, yep, it's in my Goodreads log. I've finished it. Knock that one off. Check that off my list." The point is not to get through the Sidor. Rather, the challenge of prayer is to try to find meaning in reciting the same psalms or blessings day after day. Our prayers are not supposed to be rote. In fact, the rabbis explicitly tell us that we're meant to pray to God from the fullness of our hearts. But how can we do this when we each day recite the same words? Well, on one of those many rereadings with my child, I think it was The Very Hungry Caterpillar back when he was 3 or 4 years old, I realized that the challenge of prayer is very much also the challenge of reading with children. And it's also the challenge of reading and rereading the Torah. I read to my son, "By the light of the moon, a little egg lay on a," and then I paused and he chimed in with the next word, "leaf," delighted by his familiarity with the text, with those familiar cadences. And we proceeded this way through the book with my pausing and him filling in the last word on every page. And I realized that the purpose of this ritualized experience of reading was not to find out what happened, right? There were no spoilers here, but for my son to lose himself in those phrases that had become so intimately familiar to him, even if some of them still eluded comprehension. The point was not the words I was reading to him or the text recited, but rather the connection forged between us. By the end of the book, he and I were in a different place. You might say the egg on the leaf of the book's opening page had morphed and spread wings. When we pray, as when we reread the same book, the point is in deepening a relationship with the text, with God, with the people around us. The Siddur is the book we Jews never tire of. It furnishes us with the language to articulate our hopes and dreams. Through its blessings, we give voice to our most fervent wishes for ourselves, for our world, for those we love. And the Torah, too, continues to speak to us at every stage of our lives. The text reads differently each year because we are different. We see it through new eyes against the backdrop of whatever is taking place in our lives. One year, I'm focused on Rivka's pregnancy because I too am pregnant with twins. Another year, my attention is drawn to the rivalry between Yaakov and Esav because my kids are at each other's throats. Another year, I identify with the image of Pharaoh hardening his heart, apropos of where we are in the Parsha cycle, because my son slams his door in anger and refuses to let me in. If the text seems different with each rereading, it is really because I, as the reader, have changed. Now, this notion that every new encounter with the text has the potential to elicit new sympathies, to yield new insights, I think really underlies the whole enterprise of Jewish textual commentary. Every generation's commentary informs the next generation's reading of the text, such that all our reading is cumulative. The Talmud and Midrash quote from and invoke the Torah. The medieval commentators invoke the Torah, the Midrash, the Talmud. The modern commentators invoke those who came before them, such that each new work engages, whether consciously or unconsciously, with its predecessors. Even when we move on to later texts, we never stop reading earlier ones. As a parent of multiple children, this is really true for me of my experience of rereading with my kids. Not only do I read the same books over and over again, but I read the same books to multiple children because I have 5 children, and each child reads many of the same books that his or her older siblings read with me just a couple of years earlier. And yet each time the experience is different. Each child pays attention to different questions, offering a window into what they're thinking and feeling at that particular moment in time. It's not just the text I'm learning to read, but also, I think, my child. And so parenting reminds me regularly that it's not just text, but also people who are sources of meaning and insight. But we have to know how to pay close attention. And I think that the study of Torah provides a compelling model. Jews have traditionally read the Torah very closely. I always say the rabbis are the best close readers of all time. The enterprise of Midrash is grounded in the belief that every phrase and every word, sometimes even every letter in the Torah, is significant and deserving of our attention. Like the verses of Torah that give rise to new insight, no matter how many times we read them over and over, our children, too, are infinitely rich texts. Perhaps both reading and parenting can be, each in its own way, an act of sacred devotion. I explore all these themes, the connections between reading, writing, parenthood, and Torah in this memoir I've written, Children of the Book, in which I attempt to tell the story of my family's life through the lens of the Torah and through the lens of the many other books we've read together as a family. Each part of the book corresponds to another one of the five books of Moses. In part one on Genesis, I write about the beginnings of our children's lives as readers. In part two on Exodus, and this is just in very broad strokes, of course, I write about the journey toward the liberating experience of independent reading. The third part on Leviticus centers on the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary constructed by the Israelites in the wilderness, as a metaphor for the library, which I argue is also a sacred shrine of sorts. I imagine this is also true of the JTS library, although I can say I just got back 20 minutes ago from the National Library of Israel. So it's definitely true of the National Library. If you have yet to visit, you're in for a treat. The biblical book of Numbers tells the story of the Israelites wandering through the wilderness. In part four, I chronicle how our family navigated the wilderness of COVID by reading out loud as we wandered along our own uncharted path. And then part five on Deuteronomy, a book in which Moses gives the people of Israel his own account of the past 40 years. In this part of the book, which I call Moses's memoir, I explore the challenges of autobiography and the ways we tell and retell our own stories. Each year, as we read through the Torah, I'm aware of different parallels between the experience of reading with my children and the Torah's narratives and themes. Over time and over a decade of Torah reading cycles, the way in which I connect with my children through literature has changed. In my memoir, I chart these shifts as they echo the progression of the biblical narrative, from the first picture books that create an infant's world through language to the moment my children begin reading on their own and leaving me behind atop the mountain as they enter new lands. In some ways, this is nothing new for me. I've always narrated the story of my life against the backdrop of the books I'm reading. As a child, I carried a book around with me everywhere I went, often reading while walking. Generally, I didn't look around very much. In high school, I once walked headlong into a brawl between two football players in the hallway. No one meant to hurt me, but somehow I got slammed into a row of lockers and my nose bled profusely. As a child, I not only read all the time, I also kept copious journals, many of which I still have. Those journals were as much about what I was reading as what I was doing and where I was. And so, about a decade, nearly a decade ago, when I wrote my first memoir, If All the Seas Were Ink, it was as much about dating, marriage, and early motherhood as it was about the daily page of Talmud I studied as all those personal developments were unfolding. And now, as a mother of school age children, I tell my story in this memoir against the backdrop of the children's books I've read to my children over and over, and the Torah we Jews are forever in the middle of reading. As a parent and as an educator, I feel charged to ensure that our children grow up to realize that they're part of a story much larger than themselves and that they have their own role to play in that unfolding drama. At night, when my younger children have trouble falling asleep and insist that I stay with them and tell them stories, I tell them that I'm prepared to stay in their room as long as they listen to the Parsha, which I chant to them from the glow of my cell phone screen, hoping they'll fall asleep dreaming of a ladder of angels leading all the way up to the sky. The Torah, like all great books, can be read at any age. The rabbis famously teach in Pirkei Avot that 5 is the age for beginning to study Torah, 10 for Mishnah, 15 for Talmud. But the Bible is not for babies. The Mishnah is not middle grade. The Talmud is not for teens only. Even when we move on to later texts, we never stop reading earlier ones because every subsequent text engages, whether consciously or unconsciously, with its predecessors. The story of Rachel and Leah is also the story of Meirav and Michal in the Book of Samuel. It's also the plot, I would argue, of Ann Napolitano's 2023 novel, Hello, Beautiful, as well as the story of my sister and me one evening last fall when we were chatting on the phone. It was Thursday night here in Israel, where I live, where I was placing my chalot in the oven. And it was Thursday afternoon at my sister's office at the NYU Medical Center, where she was in between patients. She told me on that phone conversation that she would also be laning, reading Torah in shul that Shabbat, Parshat Vayetze. And I told her that I knew this Parsha very well and had all sorts of tricks for remembering the patterns in the Torah reading trope. Um, Anyone who reads Torah knows that these mnemonics are known as simanim, signs. And then I joked that I was like Rachel in the Midrash, giving the simanim, the signs, to my sister Leah so that she would be able to fool Jacob into thinking that she was Rachel instead. True, I am the older sister and she is the younger. But then again, isn't the confusion between older and younger siblings what this timeless story is all about? This is what I mean, I think, to tell our stories in the context of the biblical narrative, to make the Torah story into our story. It's to tell that story in the first person, plural. We receive the Torah. We wander through the wilderness. It's, of course, what we're commanded to do every year in the words, according to the words of the Haggadah, to see ourselves as if we had gone out of Egypt. But it's not a commandment on Pesach alone. The words of the Shema, which we recite every day, there remind us of the Exodus. When we read words from Torah, it's different from reading any other book because we are the characters in that drama. The Torah tells the story of our people's history, but it's the way we tell our story too. This is the message we seek as parents and as educators to pass on to our children. The Jewish story is our story, and with every day that passes, we are writing the next chapter in that unfolding drama. Of course, I am not naive. It is not always easy to impress upon children the value of reading ourselves into a greater narrative or even the value of reading at all. I think it's something we all struggle with in an age of rapidly developing screen technology. I think about one particular afternoon last winter when I was almost a year ago, when I was on my way back from work. Now that my kids are a bit older and more independent, I'm not always home when the older ones get home from school. On days when I won't be there to greet them, I leave a note on the whiteboard affixed to our kitchen windowsill, indicating when I'll be back and what the kids can eat and any activities they have scheduled. Usually I'm home soon after, but I don't rush. I want the kids to learn how to be responsible for themselves. They know the rules, both the positive and the negative commandments. Do your homework, practice your instruments, no junk food, and above all, the rule that is most frequently violated, no screens, no games or YouTube videos on the tablet, no devices whatsoever when there is no parent home. But it turns out, of course, knowing the rules is one thing and following them is another. That day, I was on my way back from teaching a class on the weekly Parsha. It was the middle of February, and we were up to Parshat Ki Tisa, which contains the story of the golden calf, that the Israelites build while Moshe goes up the top of Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. The Israelites were supposed to wait patiently at the foot of the mountain, but they despair of Moses returning. Unable to handle the notion of an invisible abstract God unmediated by Moses, they decide to make their own God instead. They give their gold jewelry to Aaron, who melts it down and molds it into a calf. As Moses is communing with God at the top of the mountain, the people at the foothills are dancing and bowing to the calf in frenzied excitement. When Moses is still on the mountain, God tells him to hurry down because the people have built a golden calf. Moses descends in fury and is outraged to see that the people are dancing excitedly around an idol. He hurls the tablets, which shatter at the foot of the mountain, before proceeding to rebuke Aaron and the Israelites. The people had been told explicitly that they may not worship other gods or create sculpted images. They just heard these words spoken from Sinai in thunder and lightning. How could they disobey? I think about the contrast between Moses on the mountaintop and the people down below when I come into the house after teaching that afternoon. I'm eager to hear about what happened to each child in school, how they fared in my absence. I open the door, and the house is silent. I see only my 10-year-old son, Matan, in the living room playing with his Rubik's Cube. He runs over to me. Ima, the girls have been watching YouTube on the tablet since they got home. I told them to stop, that they're not allowed, but they didn't listen. They should be in big trouble. I know this is one of those parenting moments when I'm supposed to stop and take a deep breath. After all, there are many valuable ways to use screens. For all I know, my kids are practicing the multiplication tables or, I don't know, maybe even studying Torah. But I know how my twin daughters use devices, and I have no doubt about what they are doing. Like Moses, I am filled with rage. How could they disobey? For a moment, I imagine myself smashing the tablet, but I restrain myself and use my words instead. What were you thinking? I question the girls angrily when I burst into their bedroom and discover that indeed they're watching a video about mini cupcake decoration. You know you're not supposed to be on a screen when I'm not home. Liav looks at her watch. Am I earlier than she expected? Had she despaired of my return? Or had she simply lost track of time, one YouTube video leading to another, in an endless loop, like the Israelites dancing around the calf? When I tell you that you're not allowed to watch videos, I say, I mean it. It's like what I always say about junk food. When you come home from school hungry, the easiest thing to do is to just open the junk drawer and take out a handful of potato chips. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to warm anything up. You don't have to even dirty a plate. So easy, right? But then a half hour later, you're hungry again because potato chips don't fill you up. That's why you can never eat enough potato chips and never watch enough YouTube. I hope the message is clear. I'm trying to teach my kids to take the time to think about and plan for what they want to eat and how they want to spend their time. When my children do not have the option of turning on screens, they are endlessly creative in their play, as Shabbat reminds me every week. They build forts, they make lanyard bracelets. Okay, they don't do all that on Shabbat, but you get the idea. They dress up, they put on plays, but once they have access to a device, every other option suddenly seems boring and unexciting. Nothing can compete with the immediate gratification of pushing a button and watching the screen light up. Idolatry, too, provides instant gratification. We can see and touch the object of our worship. As Aaron explains to Moses after the building of the calf, I hurled the gold into the fire and out came this calf, as if the idol were fashioned of its own accord instantaneously. Belief in God, on the other hand, requires time and patience and discipline. At the core of my faith lies the conviction that if we take the time to train ourselves to be sensitive to God's presence, ultimately our lives will be fuller and more fulfilling. Part of the reason it's so important to read with children is to teach them the value of slow pleasures. Reading did not come easily for most of my kids. I sat with them as they puzzled over silent letters, confused homonyms, and stumbled over sentences they didn't know how to parse. But each of my kids is learning that if they are patient, the letters on the page will reveal themselves to be conduits of meaning. Sentences combine into paragraphs that tell a near infinite number of stories, rich with images not manufactured for them, but born of their own imaginations. Why can't we watch stories on screens? My kids like to ask me. We learn so much from videos, they try to persuade me. I imagine you've heard this argument as well. They're not wrong about that, but it's not the same. In most of the video clips my kids watch, the work of making meaning is done for them. The images flashing fully formed before their eyes in bright dynamic color. But when we read, our minds have to supply the visual imagery. Often we have to wait until the words mean something to us, until we have read enough to conjure an image of the character or scene in our mind's eye, filling in the colors and contours gradually. We may have to sit with the discomfort of not fully understanding, working through those uncertain hours of waiting at the foot of the mountain. Reading teaches children how to sit with uncertainty. When there's a screen nearby, there is always an answer that is just one AI chat or one perplexity question away. What is the capital of Bolivia? What's a good recipe for cheesy pasta? But not all questions can be answered instantaneously, and this is a very important lesson for children to learn when they are young. There are no easily searchable answers for the hardest questions in life. What do I want to be when I grow up? What are my strengths and talents? How can I help the people around me? When we read with our children, we teach them how to tolerate waiting, how to handle the not knowing, and how to live their way into the answers. It's so much harder when we can't just turn to our screens, to our idols. I think this is also the lesson of the beginning of Sefer Breshit as well. The Midrash on Parshat Lech Lecha teaches that Abraham's father was an idol worshiper and a seller of idols until Abram demonstrated to his father the ridiculousness of believing in the sentience of stone. But for a long time, Abraham and his family were the lone monotheists. It wasn't easy for the world to accept the notion of an invisible, intangible God. I imagine it was sort of like that moment when children graduate from picture books and start reading early chapter books, where there are no longer illustrations on every page. Suddenly they have to imagine, what does the little princess's attic look like? How big was Harriet the Spy's New York City apartment? We realize how much the illustrations function as a sort of Rashi's commentary, illuminating the text and filling in the missing visual detail. Bereft of those images, we have to wrestle with the text using only our own powers of imagination. Reading without pictures, like monotheism, requires a tremendous effort of imagination. We have to work to conjure everything for ourselves without our idols of images or stone. And so it's in this sense, too, I think, that reading is a sacred activity and an inherently Jewish act. Our tradition for so long eschewed visual representation in a strict interpretation of the second commandment prohibiting graven images. As a result, our texts have become our most prized possessions, our sacred jewels, our legacy. And I am very conscious of giving this talk for the JTS library. I think that as parents, as readers, as grandparents, as educators, it's our responsibility to ensure that every child finds his or her place in that textual tradition. I want to just close with a very personal story to illustrate this point. This is a story that took place, well, I guess now about a year and a half ago on Shabbat Parshat Vayera. As you can see, I remember my life in Parshiot. I was chanting from the Torah early in the morning on Shabbat in shul, and the only other member of my family in synagogue with me was my then 4-year-old son, who didn't want to sit alone in the congregation, so he came up to the Torah to stand beside me. The gabbai pulled over a chair, and my son followed along the back and forth motion of the yad with his eyes as I read about the angels who told Abraham and Sarah that they would have a baby and about Sarah's incredulous laughter. My son was just beginning to learn to read at the time. He knew his letters well enough to know that the name that appeared on his cubby in preschool, Yitzchak, was not, in fact, the name we called him, his nickname, Yitzvi, which is short for his full name, Yitzchak Tzvi. He knew well enough to jump up excitedly in the middle of the sixth Aliyah when Abraham named his son Yitzchak. That's my name! My name! He exclaimed excitedly in the middle of the Torah reading, and everyone in the congregation burst out laughing. My son, who is very sensitive, immediately crumpled. He burst into tears and ran to hide behind the ark. But I couldn't come over to calm him down because, of course, I had to finish the Aliyah and there was still one more to go. But when I could, I went over to him during the Haftorah and I said to him, "Oh, no, they weren't laughing at you. I promise." But he was unfortunately inconsolable. No, he told me they were laughing at me. They were. I felt as if we were replicating the conversation between Abraham and Sarah earlier in the Parsha, when Abraham is offended by Sarah's laughter at the angel's annunciation, perhaps assuming that she is suspicious of his virility. "I did not laugh," Sarah lies to Abraham, but Abraham knows the truth. "You did laugh," he replies. Sarah tries to explain that marvel is a far cry from mockery. But if Sarah couldn't convince Abraham, then how could I possibly convince my 4-year-old that my laughter was not at his expense? For my disconsolate Yitzvi, it was laughter none the less. It was a long time before I was able to calm him down, dry his tears, and attempt to explain not just how much I love him, but why his comment made me so proud of him too. He had found his name in the Torah. The story captures for me what I think we all aspire to do as Jews, as parents, as educators, etc., which is to help our children and our students find their own place in the Torah, to read their stories into the Torah's narratives. The Torah, as Moshe describes it in the book of Deuteronomy, is Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. It is the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. It is our heirloom, our legacy, our precious jewel. As the rabbis say in the Midrash, there's a crown of royalty for the kings, a crown of priesthood for the priests, but the crown of Torah is there for anyone to take. May we merit to adorn ourselves and our children with that crown, nurturing and cultivating a commitment to texts, to reading, and to the rich heritage of our tradition. Thank you.
Wow. I think can you hear me? Yes, I'm unmuted. Oh, Ilana, fabulous. Thank you so much. Before we open up to others, the way you presented and you really, you offered what I would describe as a spirited defense of reading as a sacred activity, from someone who is clearly, a reader par excellence. So I think that raises some interesting questions. Is it okay if in a playful way, I challenge you a little bit on some of what you said? Okay. So what, I mean, what you just did beautifully and really elegantly was to offer an argument for the centrality of reading, um, in our sense of that term. What I mean by our sense is that when we think of reading as something we do from a text. We might chant it, we might read out loud, as we often do with children, and you spoke about that at the beginning. But for most of us as adults or as readers, once we become readers as children, the words are in our head. They're not expressed aloud, let alone in a way that others can hear. Yet, um, the word that we use in Hebrew for read, right, kore, kra, probably originally means not read, but recite. the Semitic root, which is also the foundation of the word Quran in Islamic tradition. It's about recitation, and certainly our mikra, what we call mikra, scripture, right? The English word that we use, scripture, is talks about writing, but it was certainly recited, and crucially, the experience of most Druze through the ages, when books were rare, when manuscripts were all we had, even if it's the manuscript of the Torah. People did not sit in the synagogue with printed Torah texts on their laps as we do. That would have been a foreign experience. And so for most Jews through the ages, the experience of the text would have been the experience of hearing it declaimed, hearing it recited. I would just, which is very, very different than reading, I think, in the way that you just described it. Um, the other thing I would add to this, and this is maybe a little bit a curious challenge with respect to your discussion of the screens. Uh, you approach this with some autobiography, so I'll do the same. I've got a daughter who is a TV producer, who also has close connections in the theater community. And, as I followed her career, I've also grown to appreciate, and here I speak as a text person. I'm a professor of Talmud. I spend a lot of time with, reciting in my head words that are on the page. But um, when things are performed, right, and they're done well, let it be on the theater stage or let it even be on a screen, there are communications there of meaning, of emotion, of drama that can be as instructive and even more moving than virtually anything else. So since that can take place on the screen, is the screen the problem or something else? I guess you can hear how, what you've been saying really it caused me to think in a lot of directions. I've said enough in my question, so please go
No,
ahead.
no, thank you. Thank you for all those reflections. I will say that I am a big believer in committing text to memory. In fact, that's really the main reason why I chant from the Torah every week, because I am really committed to having Torah in my head all the time so that I can always recite it. I, always test myself, like I want to be able to finish any pasuk that someone starts. That's always my goal. So I'm a big believer in I used to memorize poetry, and then I kind of switched to memorizing Torah, but that's another story. But I believe that sort of maybe the ultimate, like, even better than reading is being able to master a text to such an extent that you know it like Baal Peh, that you know it by heart, which really means that you own it, right? You own it literally. Like you can command it. So I totally get that. I'm also a swimmer. I swim a lot. For long stretches, and while I'm swimming, I'm always reciting in my head. And I know there's some people who listen to things underwater. I never do that, but I really use the time to I just repeat things in my head, and try to just sort of draw on the stores of what I've remembered. Um, in terms of silent reading versus reading out loud, it's really interesting because there's an interesting passage that I came across not long ago in Augustine's Confessions when he describes seeing his teacher, his mentor, Ambrose, reading silently, right? And he says, that passage, and he's astonished to see this because it's so unusual
Hmm.
because everyone at that time would read out loud. And there's a story in the Talmud of Bruria kicking a student who's learning to himself instead of reading out loud, because of course you should read out loud. I will say that when I teach Talmud and Midrash, I always tell my students that the number one rule is you have to read out loud with your study partner. Do not read to yourselves. I really believe that when we read texts aloud, we breathe life into them. Really, in the same way that God breathed life into Adam and made Adam a living sentient being, we do that to the text. We enliven the text by reading it out loud. And I will say that when I read poetry, even to myself, quote unquote, I always try to read it out loud or find someone to subject the poetry to, much to the consternation of my family members, because I really think that texts are meant to be read aloud. And it's sad that we do so much of our reading silently. maybe to an extent, audiobooks are an answer to that, that a lot more and more people are listening to their texts read aloud. And so sometimes the technology can, you know, revive ancient forgotten practices in a funny way. And also, I think, look, I think that in terms of performances and seeing a story enacted, as you said, can happen on the stage or on a screen. I think that when parents read to their kids, in the best kind of experience, the parents, again, are breathing life into the text or acting out the text. I have certain books that I read to my kids, especially books in rhyme, where I have melodies that I always sing, like that go like a kind of chant, like they're really kind of incantatory that go with certain books that I read to them, and my kids know them with the chant, that's how they've learned the books. A lot of Dr. Seuss we read like that. So yeah, so I really and ultimately I think that's, we have in our tradition, we have both texts that are meant to be we have Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat, right? We have a written tradition and we have an oral tradition. That is to say, there are texts that were traditionally written down and transmitted in written form. And we also have texts that were traditionally transmitted by recitation and for a long time were not written down and needed to be committed to memory in order to be preserved. So I think there's definitely room for reviving that practice of the forgotten practice of memorization. My kids almost never have to memorize anything in school. Maybe like, I don't know, just the multiplication tables, which is really not merely memorizing. It's different. They're not really reciting it. But I really, I wish my kids, when my kids were younger, I thought I would teach them all these poems by heart. Alas, that never really took root. I wonder why. My Israeli children didn't want to memorize Robert Frost. Can you imagine why ever not? But anyway, I would, but I think that if I were locked in a prison cell and I don't know, I like to think that I could draw on those stores and I had no books to read. I mean, I like to think
Yeah.
I could draw on those stores of memorized poetry and verses of Torah.
Wonderful. I'm just curious, could you imagine inviting, yeah, your children to join you in watching a TV show if you judged it to be something that was worth engaging?
My kids argue with me. This is like the number one fight in our house, so it's funny that you should ask that. They're always trying to show me things that they
Hmm.
discover, like videos on screen. Um, I, I can imagine it. It has yet to happen, but I can imagine it. I personally am just not a TV person. It's just not. I don't have patience for TV for whatever reason. It's just not a medium that works for me. And I tend to view it at best a babysitter, I guess. So
Uh-huh.
I will say I have tried to watch movies with my children on occasion, but I don't think I've ever made it.
Oh, okay, okay.
Not proud of that.
No, it is what it is. I'll ask one more question, then open up to others. I think your interpretation of Deuteronomy as Moses's memoir is really fabulous. I mean, what a wonderful way to think about it, and that is, in a way, what it is. I mean, it's a particular kind of memoir, but it is a memoir. And when you said that, it made me think, oh, and here we have an author whose books are memoirs,
Mhm.
right? So I'm wondering what you would say about the memoir's form and its universality or lack thereof. I guess what I'm thinking is, do you think everyone should write a memoir? Does everyone have a memoir to write, a story to tell in that sense? Or is it only people like Moses, right, who should be
Mhm.
writing memoirs?
Um, yeah, it's really interesting. I have to say that I never really read memoirs at all until I happened to discover that I wrote one. And the way I discovered that I wrote one was because my publisher sent me the jacket to approve of my first book. And it said in small letters under the title, it said a memoir. And I wrote back and said, well, the cover is beautiful, but why are you calling this a memoir? Isn't it a Talmud book? And they were like, no, it's a memoir. And I was like, a memoir? Who am I to write a memoir? My life's not that interesting. Like, anyway, so that was, and then I actually really started reading memoirs. And now I have to say, I actually do read quite a lot of memoirs. Um, um, who knew? but in terms of whether whether everyone should write a memoir, like, I think that there's a lot of value in narrating our own stories, and I say this as an inveterate journal keeper. That I think when we recount, narrate the story of our lives, we first of all, I think there's a lot to begin. I think it's a source of insight, reflection. I think we do things better the next time when we're confronted with the same situation. That is to say, it can be an impetus for tshuva. I think that when we write down our experiences, we also have the chance to um, I don't know, to imagine how it could be otherwise, to imagine other perspectives that maybe were lost to us on the first experience. So I think, yes, there's a lot of value in journal keeping as a practice. And it's something I'm very committed to, and really encourage in my kids. One of the five agrees with me. So, you take what you can get. But anyway, but yeah, I do think there's a lot of value in that. Whether everyone has to publish their memoirs, I think that's a different story. A very different story. I mean, the reason I referred to Deuteronomy as Moshe's memoir is mainly because I think that a memoir is a selective retelling of one's life in which one converts one's life into art. That is to say, it's not like an autobiography, it's not a documentary, it's really a selective retelling and reshaping of the raw material of lived experience
Hmm.
into something beautiful, ideally, and meaningful, right?
Hmm.
Ideally, that's what the memoirist aspires to. So Moshe doesn't tell us everything that happened, right? Moshe, well, he picks and chooses what he's going to share with us. He starts, at I believe he starts at Har Sinai, like Rav Lechem Shevet Bahar Hazeh. Like he starts where at what to him is the most compelling moment. And he very slight. He doesn't tell us anything about his childhood, right? When he retells story, but he picks and chooses what for him are the most compelling and significant in terms of looking forward, in terms of what awaits the Israelites. He selects for them what's most important for them to remember with a very pedagogical and moralistic eye, I think.
Hmm.
That is to say that a person writes a memoir usually with some goal in mind, some purpose in mind, and it's not, and that purpose is usually not just recounting everything that happened. And so in that section of my book, I write about. I primarily focus on the Little House on the Prairie series and the All of a Kind Family series because both of those series are children's books that were written when the authors very consciously made a decision to take their own recollections from childhood and convert them into stories. In Laura Ingalls Wilder's case, it was very explicit that she did it to make money. When, the farm wasn't solvent, she tried to, make money off her stories of her upbringing. Um, anyway, and I read biographies by both critical biographies of both of those authors, and really was very interested in sort of what motivates someone to tell the story of their lives, and also I was very interested in what do they leave out and why, what remains on the cutting room floor and why. And I feel like when writing a memoir, those decisions are just as important. What you leave out is just as important as what you include. And that was also a large part of my process in writing this book, especially now that I have older children and needed to be careful or wanted to be careful about what I shared about them. I did think a lot about what I would include, what I would exclude. So, word of caution to anyone aspiring to write a memoir.
Got it. Okay. So let's open it up. Anybody who's got a question for Ilana, please feel free to unmute yourself and say it out loud, and we will all hear you. Anybody? I see. Sandy, did you just remove your?
I just want to say that I really enjoyed the book, Ilana. I just finished a couple of days ago. It was really fabulous.
Thank you.
And I don't know if you remember Rabbi Alex Friedman. He's going to read it too when he has time. He might have been one of your students.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nice. Anybody else? Testimonies are welcome. How did your kids feel, Ilana, about being, in this book? How did they respond?
Yeah, I have to say it was much harder for me to write this book. When I finished my last book, my oldest was 2, and I had twins who were 6 months. So not only did they not really speak, and therefore could they not have any say in the matter of what I wrote about them, but also, they didn't do anything. There was no room to embarrass them, like and this was very different. My oldest is now 14, and I said my youngest is 5. And that so it was a really very it was very different. They know that I've written a book about them. They have None of them have read it in its entirety, but I did read to each of my kids the sections in which they appear. And when they asked me to change things, I did. They love to say, like, Emma, that's not how it happened. You got that all wrong. No, no, no. And I didn't change things because I got things wrong, because as I said, memoir is not documentary. But I did try to respect the way I portray them. Thankfully, I have multiple sons and multiple daughters, so I, when necessary, could resort to at least the pretense of ambiguity by saying my son or my daughter. So yes, so that was definitely helpful. I also will say that none of my kids read my first book either, but not long ago, maybe it was when my daughter was like 10 or 11. She pulled that book off the shelf. I think we had guests for Shabbos, and I don't know, sometimes she likes to say, like, my Emma wrote a book or whatever. So she showed the book at the Shabbos table. And then I guess because it was off the shelf, she started reading the flap copy. All of a sudden, she blurted out, like, in a moment of silence at the table, she said, "What, Emma? You were divorced? What?" That was kind of funny. Like, you never know what your kids, don't know what they anyway. So, maybe someday they'll read it, maybe not. My kids are growing up in a very different cultural milieu than I grew up in, which was in fact a lot of my motivation in reading to them, as I write in the book, namely to try to impart to them some of the richness of my own English language literary heritage. I mean both American and British literature. But yeah, so I don't know. I hope I haven't embarrassed them. That's all I can say. I really hope I haven't embarrassed them. So,
Okay, and the answer, of course, is inevitably you have, because
inevitably
that's
I
that's
have.
that's one of the things that a parent does.
Right,
David
right.
Goldstein, please.
Yeah, what is a good book to teach young children about God?
Mm,
Oh,
that's
great
an interesting
question.
question. Wow. Um, Aside from the Torah, um,
Yeah, aside from the Torah.
aside from the Torah, because that's where I would start, I suppose. Um, I think that's where I would start, but I don't know beyond that. It's a really good question. I don't know. I would say that we don't have many God conversations in our house. It's interesting. We have a lot of text conversations. Um, but yeah, I would say reading Torah, reading Midrashim with kids. I read a lot of Midrash with my kids, mainly like in the context of discussing the Parsha. We ask a lot of why questions. And I think just if you read the Torah closely with your kids, it will generate a lot of God questions. How can God harden Paro's heart in this week's parsha, or and how can that be fair, or whatever it is. I think I would start with the Torah. And they're also thankfully now more and more very accessible Parsha books for children. I recently translated a really great series by the Israeli writer Emily Emrusi. I really encourage you to check that out. The series is called The Parsha. It's a 5-volume series, beautifully illustrated, and it's a great book for sharing Torah with kids. And it has at the end of every Parsha, there are a few, like, there are discussion questions, some of which are about God. So maybe that would be a good place to start.
Hmm, that's good. There's also you can find Hasidic stories, which you can select amongst. You can Google that, but there are rich resources of Hasidic stories which teach both ethical lessons and deal with, and God enters into those discussions
Mm.
as well. Well, we're arriving at the end of our hour.
And I,
And just before I say thank you, I want to observe the irony. We'll recall that Plato condemned writing as destructive of memory. You, Ilana, have condemned, oh, before we do, as destructive of memory. But of course, the only reason we know Plato so well is because of writing. By the same token, you, Ilana, have condemned screens. And yet the only reason we're able to get together with you and learn all of this is because we're all on screen. I just note the irony. Um, so thank you everybody for joining us. We, the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, feel great to be able to have events such as this. You all know where to buy books, right? So if you don't have the book, you can go on your screen and you follow it up in ways. You can try your local bookstores as well, but I don't know where everybody's living, so. Right, you can go, I guess, request it from your local bookstore, right?
And I would just add, if you don't mind my saying, if you do read the book and you do like it, please write a customer review on Amazon
There
because
you
they
go.
really help. So thank you.
Yep, all good, all good. There will be other book talks. Please look for our announcements. And I do have to just say, tonight, we here at JTS, the library, we will be opening a new exhibition in our exhibition galleries. It's an exhibition devoted to the history of conversion to Judaism, actually, as illustrated through rare works. And it's very, very interesting. So if you are in New York or you find yourself in New York in the next, it'll be nearly 6 months. We invite you to come and see some of our rare materials and learn about conversion to Judaism. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank
Bye
you.
bye, and thank you, Ilana.
Thank you so much.
Mm.